It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce former Senator John Breaux. I first met Senator Breaux when I was a staff economist at the Joint Committee on Taxation, the Congressional Joint Committee. And Mr. Breaux at the time served in the Senate Finance Committee. And he was a key member on a wide range of bipartisan legislation. And what really struck me was his willingness to work in a bipartisan way. And I think that really did contribute a lot. It was one of the keys to his success as a legislator. Nowadays, Senator Breaux is co-chair of the public policy practice at Squire Patton Boggs, and he regularly advises clients on a wide range of strategic issues and imparts wisdom to those clients. So today we're happy that Senator Breaux has chosen to impart some of that wisdom to us. So join me now in welcoming Senator Breaux up to the podium.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Mark. I'm hobbling up here. I have a big boot on. It's a tear in my Achilles tendon. And I canceled my surgery, and I decided to do stem cell injections on last Monday, which is an interesting process in and of itself. If you ever want to do that, come see me first. Thank you for inviting me. I'm glad to be here. I see a lot of old friends and good friends in the tax world out there. And so I'm delighted to share some thoughts. Kathy Koch just told me, talk about your carbon dividend tax. And I've corrected her, it is not a carbon dividend tax. It is a carbon dividend and not a tax. And the difference, obviously, is the fact that the way we have structured it is that it would, the $40 a ton fee on carbon emissions would be returned back to the general population, as opposed to a tax which goes to the Treasury and to the government to spend on various programs. And I'm really excited about it. I don't want to talk about that, but I mean, this is a marathon. It's not going to be a sprint. It's going to take quite a while to get it done. We're spending a great deal of time educating the Congress, both Democrats, who are a much easier proposition, and then also the Republicans. And our firm at Squire Patton Boggs, Trent Lott and I are the two co-managers of the public policy section of the firm. And so I told Trent I would take on this issue, I'd take care of all the Democrats, and he had to take care of all the Republicans. And he said, oh, thanks a lot. But I think we're making progress, and I think that the report that the administration itself put out on the adverse effects of climate change is very significant. And what we have to offer is a solution to the serious problem, which is projected to do better in terms of carbon reduction even than the Paris Accord did, or even than the regulations of the Obama administration. So we're very excited about that effort, and but we just got to make sure, Kathy, we call it a carbon dividend, not a carbon tax. So we'll move on from there. Also in our firm, where we have Boehners in the firm too, and I got, of course, Trent Lott and Jack Kingston, my good Republican friends in the firm. We were talking last week about whether, they asked me whether I thought this past election was a blue wave. And I said, no, I don't think it was a blue wave. I think it was a blue tornado because the significance of the changes in the election were really very dramatic. While the Republicans gained 2 seats in the Senate, and it's a 53-47 margin in the Senate, the House looks like Democrats will pick up about 40, thereby putting the Democrats in the majority come January the 3rd. I'll say a little bit about that, but in addition to those congressional elections, there were 7 governor seats that were won by Democrats, and attorney generals in the country for the first time in a decade or so, a majority of the attorney generals in the United States are now going to be Democrat. 6 state legislators' seats went from Republican to Democrat, and over 400 state legislative seats around the country flipped from Republican to Democrat. By any measure, it was a blue wave or whatever you want to call it. I called it a blue tornado. It was a massive change in what the electorate was sending out in their views on how they were voting in this last election. I think there are a lot of members on the Republican side in the House who have never served in the minority. And Mark and I were talking about it previously, that have no comprehension about the difference in being in the minority and being in the majority in the House. If you're in the minority in the House, you're in the minority. And that means that you can only speak when the majority tells you can. You can only offer an amendment if the Republican Rules Committee or the Majority Rules Committee allow you to offer an amendment. They can tell you how long you can speak or if you can speak at all. And as you saw in the last tax bill in the House, you can be entirely shut out on any of the negotiations or any of the participation whatsoever. So being in the difference between the minority in the House and the minority in the Senate is astronomically different. And I think a lot of Republicans in the House have not really fully comprehended yet what that difference means. I think also the White House has not fully understood what they are facing with a Democratic majority in the House in terms of oversight, in terms of investigations, in terms of things that can happen that they didn't have to worry about in the last cycle. So it's going to be a substantially big difference. When I talk to tax groups, I'm reminded of the time that I spent with my co-chairman at that time, Connie Mack from Florida, when we chaired the President Bush's Tax Reform Commission, where we spent a year and a half working on tax reform and completed a report that was about that thick and submitted it to President Bush, who all of his people said, great job, wonderful work that y'all did, and then they did nothing. I remember one time walking into the Bush's office, President Bush's office, and walking behind his desk. And I was looking behind his desk, and he said, bro, what the hell are you doing? I said, Mr. President, I'm looking for my tax reform package that we gave you. Obviously, you must have filed it and lost it because you never did anything with it. He responded, oh, get the hell out of here. And the reason why it was so difficult, because the charge that we had at that time was we had to reform the tax code, which we did. We cut corporate taxes, we cut individual taxes across the board. But we paid for those tax cuts, which is what their instruction was. You do tax reform, make changes, but make sure you don't run up the deficit and that you pay for the tax. And we did. We did it in ways that were controversial, but ways that were the ways we thought it should be accomplished by eliminating a large number of the state and local tax deductions for higher income people. We put a cap on the mortgage interest deductions you could take, and we also put a cap on your health care benefits that you would receive before some of that income, some of that benefit would start to be taxed. That paid for the reduction in the individual taxes and for the corporate taxes. But that also created huge political problems that they didn't want to touch. And the fact that one of the chairmen of the Ways and Means Committee was Bill Thomas from California, pretty high tax state, and the ranking member, Charlie Rangel from New York, pretty high tax state. They didn't think our idea about eliminating the state and local tax deduction was very good, and we knew we had an uphill battle to fight. So that's what happened then, and that's how hard it is to get these things ultimately accomplished. I thought I would just spend a little bit of time, and I'm happy to try and answer questions after, to talk to you about where we are now and what's likely to happen. Number one, I think that Richie Neal and Kevin Brady have the potential to have a working relationship that could benefit to this country's interests in the sense that I think they're both fairly pragmatic people. I think there are areas that they can find common ground on and working together. Infrastructure, retirement, savings benefits, I think, are things that they would have a common interest in finding that they would be able to work together on. So I think that lineup, I think, is fairly good. In the Senate, obviously, with Chuck Grassley, who's been chairman before, working again with Ron Wyden, is something that is not going to upset the apple cart that much from the previous Orrin Hatch's position. And I think that they have an ability to understand that if they're going to get things done with a Democratic House and a Republican Senate, that they're going to have to find areas of compromise that they did not have to do last year. I mean, if you look at the procedures in the House last year, the Democrats were totally and completely cut out of the debate, cut out of the meetings, cut out basically of doing and having any input into the tax bill. So I think that time is probably going to end because of the division between the Republican House and the Democratic House and the Republican Senate. I think that if you're looking at any major changes in last year's tax bill, the tax bill, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, I don't think that's likely to happen. And I say that because you still have to get something that the House would pass and making changes in corporate and individual tax cuts. I think that obviously they have to understand that they still have to try and get 60 votes in the Senate, which is not likely to happen. You're not likely, in my opinion, to see any major revisions or changes in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act program. But I do think that what the House Democrats are likely to do is to start having hearings on the last tax bill, in-depth hearings on what it means in terms of the deficit, which indicates it's about $113 billion, 17% increase in the deficit as a result of the tax cut. I think they're going to have hearings on what's the effect, what's happening out there. Are you surprised by the results of the tax cuts on the deficit? I think they'll have hearings on that. I think they'll also look at the question of job creation. How much jobs have been created as a result of the tax cut last year, which was called the Jobs Act? Is it really stimulating the economy? I think they can have some very serious, in-depth hearings in that particular area. I think the Ways and Means Committee has indicated, I know they have, that any new tax cuts are going to have offsets. And let me tell you, that is something that, it's easy to cut taxes if you don't have to worry about paying for it. I mean, that's a simple, I love to do that as a politician. Oh, we're cutting your taxes. Oh, I have to pay for it too? Oops, that's the problem. And that's why I mentioned what we tried to do in the Bush Reform Commission, because we paid for it. Easy to cut the taxes, but if you're going to have offsets on it, then you got a real problem. I remember when I was a freshman on the Finance Committee, Bob Dole became the, I think he might have been chairman of the ranking. He must have been chairman at that time. I had a proposal which was benefiting the energy industry, being from Louisiana, and I remember that I offered my amendment, and I had to pay for it. My pay for it was limiting the deductibility of country club dues on your income tax return. You no longer could do that, and that was my pay for. I had to pay for it, so I had my little amendment. I offered it, had my pay for, and so what happened? Bob Dole looked over at me. He says, I think that's a great idea. He took my deduction, my offset, and applied it to his amendment and passed. And so I didn't have my pay for it anymore. And so I learned very quickly, never offer an offset until it's time. I offered mine much too early. Bob Dole picked it up and ran with it, and I didn't have my offset for my amendment. My amendment failed. His passed with my deduction. So I think that what they're looking at is a procedure whereby there will be in-depth hearings on what's happened with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and oversight hearings on it, particularly on the size of the deficit and also the amount of job creation that you're going to have. I think they're also talking about any technical corrections. I don't think they're going to be that happy with doing them without some hearings on it. I mean, bear in mind that the mistakes were made by the Republicans who were in the majority without the Democrats' participation. So when they come to the Democrats in the House and say, oh, we need these technical corrections because we screwed up on some of these positions that we took in the drafting areas, so let's have some technical corrections, I think there's going to be a lot of Democrats who will say, wait a minute, hold up. We're just not going to wholesale pass the technical corrections right now without some hearings on many of these that you're doing. Let's hold off and find out what the effect is. And I think one of them that could be is an appreciation on shopping centers and businesses improvements, which I think everybody understands and realizes was pretty much a drafting mistake. And I think that something like that could be corrected. It's obviously bipartisan. Both sides understand that was something that was done. But I think there's going to be a little bit of a hesitancy on doing a wholesale technical corrections, certainly in the lame duck. I don't think it's going to happen. But any corrections or any extenders, I think, obviously, that they do next year would be made retroactive to cover the beginning of 2018. So, I mean, that's kind of where I think we are. I think IRS and Treasury will continue to do the rules. I know we just had a rule, I think, yesterday on the foreign tax credits. I think it moves in the right direction. I'm not sure it's sufficient or enough from what I'm hearing from the industry as far as the clarification on the foreign tax credit, and I think it may require additional work from Treasury and IRS on that particular aspect. Let me just run through a whole bunch of other things that I think are on the plate for what might or might not be done. As I said, the tax extenders, they don't have enough votes to pass the tax extenders as a package in the Senate with 60 votes, in my opinion. Do they put it on a spending bill and try to get it done as a spending addition to a spending bill? That's a possibility. It's going to be tough enough to avoid a shutdown of the government because of Trump saying, I want $5 billion on the wall. And the Congress, I think, is not likely to do that. If they can do something that would say, we'll give you half now and half later, maybe that's a possibility. But the continuing resolution is going to be complicated enough without trying to add all the tax extenders to it. So it may be something that will have to be provided in the beginning of the next Congress, which would, of course, I think, be made retroactive until the beginning of 2018. But any wholesale passage of Kevin Brady's bill, I think, it's not going to happen in the Senate. They have no appetite for making some of those tax cuts permanent. One thing that I think is a possibility is something on Retirement Enhancement and Savings Act, the RESA program, which I think there's strong bipartisan support for. Democrats and Republicans both are going to seek a way to enact that retirement enhancement and savings process, which I think is feasible. I think that taxation of the digital economy, I'm not sure if any of y'all are following that very much, but I mean, it's a very important concern that I think everybody has expressed concern about. Grassley, Orrin Hatch, and Ron Wyden have also expressed concerns about what the EU may be doing in trying to move on taxing revenues from digital commerce, and have indicated very strongly that we have some real problems with that and think that it's probably WTO inconsistent, and have made our positions very clear to them on that. Some of the other things, I've had somebody tell me, well, we're going to get Trump's tax returns. I don't know that Richie Neal is going to start off his agenda trying to go after Trump's tax returns. I think he has other things that he thinks are more important right now. For the life of me, we were talking about that in the back, about, Trump says, you can't see my tax returns because they're under audit. I mean, I'd like to have the IRS come up and say, is there any reason why someone whose taxes are under audit can't show those tax returns? The answer is no. They can show them. You know that, Commissioner. There's no rule that says you can't show it. Yeah, And then how long does a tax audit last? I mean, is it decades? I mean, how long? I mean, I'll show you my tax returns as soon as the audit's over. Well, when is that? After you're no longer president? I mean, how long does it take to do the audits? I know they're complicated, but there's no rule that says you can't show them. But I don't think Richard Neal is going to move in that direction that quickly. There's something on nonprofit donor disclosure requirements. I know House Democrats are really ready to move against a policy change on the 501c4 charitable foundations not having to list their names of their donors on their tax filings. I think that there are Democrats who would like to have that changed. There's also a change in the so-called Johnson Amendment. Democrats may push to protect the old Lyndon Johnson Amendment from Republican attempts to repeal it. That was kind of an interesting deal where the tax code provision forbids nonprofits such as religious groups from endorsing political candidates. I know I ran for the Senate in Louisiana, and I used to travel around, particularly to churches, and you talk about participate in politics. Some of the churches in the South were very aggressive. I mean, if you were invited to the church during your election and the preacher recognized you, that was positive. If you were asked to come up and make remarks, that was even more positive. But if after your remarks the preacher got up and endorsed you, that was really significant. And many times it depended on the size of your contribution to the church collection as to how far you got up in the stream. But it's not supposed to happen, and a lot of folks are thinking that they shouldn't be engaged in that. I think stock buyback oversight is probably something Democrats would like to look into, which I think is important. And then I mentioned the deficit of the last tax return. And state and local tax deductions, that may come up as far as some people wanting to get back and removing those caps, but that's going to be very difficult to do. So, I mean, that's kind of a quick overview of where I think we're going. I think that with a divided government, let me conclude with that with a divided government, both sides are going to have to realize, unlike the last Congress, that unless there's some legitimate compromises between the two sides, absolutely nothing will get passed into law. And I think the people in the leadership understand that and know that. The leaders of the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, I think, are going to be sort of forced to be more cooperative than they have been in the past. And I think that's good news for everybody. With that, thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer a question or two, if that's okay. Yeah, yes, anybody. Stand up and holler at me. Yes, sir. Oh, anybody? Way back there.
Oh, thanks. I'm Paul Marion from MLEX U.S. Tax Watch. And there's been
I'm sorry, where from?
MLEX U.S. Tax Watch. We're a subsidiary of LexisNexis.
Sure.
And there's been a lot of discussion about the impact Richard Neal will have on tax policy in the process. But nobody has mentioned Mike Quigley, who's going to be the new chair of the Financial Services Appropriations Subcommittee overseeing the IRS budget. In short, what do you think the appetite is for a significant increase in the IRS budget in the fiscal 20 appropriations coming up?
That's a question I don't have a good answer for, quite frankly. I think that if they can show that there's a need for it, I think you'll have a more sympathetic group of members, particularly Richie Neal, and them being favorable to that, with Quigley being more, I think, inclined to make sure they have enough money to run the program and not be so anti-government. I think that the possibility is probably better now than it was in the previous Congress as far as getting necessary funding. Yes, sir. Yeah.
If some compromises are reached to get something done on the Hill, what do you think are the chances of the White House scuttling that for the wall or some other reason?
The question is, if they come up with something that both sides can agree to, does that mean that Trump will necessarily sign it? Absolutely no. I mean, you never know what he's going to do from day to day. I mean, his statements on General Motors taking away their tax subsidies, I mean, it's a law on tax subsidies for alternative vehicles and electric cars. It applies to everybody's electric cars, not just GM. So how do you say, all right, we're going to take away the subsidy for one company and give it to everybody else? Because the law is pretty clear that the incentives for electric car vehicles, et cetera, apply to all manufacturers, not just to GM. So he just announces that he's going to take away the tax subsidies for GM on their electric cars and alternative vehicles. So you never know. The bottom line is you never know what he's going to do. I think he's going to have to come to the realization, which I think he doesn't understand as so far, that this is a different day come January the 3rd. It's a different political landscape that he has to deal with. And it's not enough for him to say, look, I'm not going to do this, because he has a divided government now. He's going to have to realize, despite his lack of experience in government, that this is a different day. And hopefully some of the members on the Republican side can convince him that these things that they've reached an agreement on in a bipartisan fashion should be signed. And that's my hope, to convince him that this is a different day. I mean, he could say, no, I'm not going to do this in this Congress, but in the next Congress, it's a different ballgame. So hopefully they'll be able to come up with some bipartisan answers that he will be willing to sign. I'm a big fan of Richard Neal. I think he's pragmatic. I think he knows how to get things done, and I think he'll be able to work with Kevin Brady and Grassley. Grassley's going to, I think, Grassley was an oversight king when he was chairman of the committee. I mean, we oversaw everything. I mean, we had more companies brought in. I think they're going to be very aggressive in the oversight from the Finance Committee under Grassley, much more so than they were under Chairman Hatch. So it's going to be some interesting times. Yes, sir. You can just holler out, I'll hear you.
Thank you very much. A little off topic, but since you brought it up, the powers of the presidency. Do you think the Congress will revisit the kinds of things that this president has done that we all thought would require congressional approval? For example, on immigration, on tariffs, on taxes. I mean, you can go on executive order. I mean, he seems to have broken every norm. Do you think Congress will revisit the powers that we give to this president, or any presidency?
I'd add to that the national security findings on the tariffs. I mean, the fact that we're importing automobiles is a national security threat. I mean, so I'm going to put a 25% tariff on imported cars because it's a national security threat, or that steel coming from Canada is a national security threat. I mean, he just makes these declarations without any, I think, reason to back it up from a legal, from the legal parameters that are required to have a national security finding, among others that you just mentioned. So I think the answer is yes. The House of Representatives is not going to be able to pass a lot of things that they would like to pass because you have a Republican-controlled Senate. But they can have hearings and oversight hearings on all of these areas with subpoena power for the various departments that are implementing programs that people feel are not following the law of the land. And it's going to be pretty difficult if they get the secretaries to come in and try and defend some of their positions that they feel are contrary to the existing law. I think that they're going to have a hard time defending some of these positions that would shed public light on it. That was not possible in this past 2 years because the House was just absolutely refusing to do any type of legitimate and credible oversight. So you got some chairmen of the oversight and intelligence committees that are absolutely committed to exercising their authority, and hopefully to do it in a very real and proper manner to do oversight on all of these issues that you just mentioned. Legislation with a Republican Congress, a Republican Senate won't go anywhere. I mean, if you have an effort to pass, so you pass a bill in the Senate, in the House, it restricts the president's power to do something, whatever the issue is, pick out the one that's probably the most vulnerable, and you pass it in the House, the Senate is not likely to take it up. The Senate's not likely to, certainly not likely to pass it, so you still have that stalemate. But I think the public pressure from the oversight hearings could work in a very strong manner and to try to get public support behind the changes that need to be made. But it's going to take that kind of a public airing of the abuses in order to get the public support in order to make any changes, I think. Somebody else was waving at me goodbye, or they were asking a question. I forgot which one it was. If not, I thank you all very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.